The winter wind cut through the empty streets of Manchester like a sharp knife. Snow had been falling all day, covering the city in a thick white blanket. The old stadium stood quiet and dark, except for a few lights that still glowed in the training area. Michael Thompson pulled his jacket tight round his shoulders as he walked slowly toward the parking area. His legs felt heavy after 3 hours of hard practice. The team had an important match coming up next week, and the coach had made them run extra drills until their muscles ached. Michael was tired, but he felt good about his performance. Football had always been his escape, his way of finding peace in a busy world. As he reached into his pocket to find his car keys, something caught his eye. There, sitting alone on a wooden bench near the stadium gates, was an older man. The man sat very still, like a statue in the falling snow. He wore an old green jacket that looked like it had seen many years of wear. In his hands, he held a small piece of cardboard with words written on it in black marker. Most people who passed by the bench looked away quickly. Some crossed to the other side of the street to avoid walking too close. Others pretended they didn't see the man at all, keeping their eyes fixed straight ahead as they hurried past. But something about the way the man sat there, so quietly and with such dignity, made Michael slow down his steps. The man wasn't calling out to people or making noise. He wasn't bothering anyone or acting in a way that would make others uncomfortable. He just sat there, holding his sign, waiting patiently in the cold night air. There was something in his posture that spoke of strength, even in his difficult situation. Michael stopped walking and stood there for a moment, watching the man from a distance. Snow continued to fall on both of them, but the older man didn't seem to mind. He sat straight and proud, despite the cold weather and his obvious need for help. Finally, Michael made a decision. Instead of walking to his car and driving home to his warm house, he turned and walked toward the bench. His footsteps crunched softly in the fresh snow as he approached. "Good evening, sir," Michael said in a gentle voice as he came closer to the bench. The older man looked up with surprise. His eyes were tired, but they were also kind and intelligent. Despite his situation, there was warmth in his face when he smiled. "Good evening, young man," the older man replied politely. "That was a fine match you played last week against Liverpool. You scored 2 beautiful goals." Michael was surprised that this homeless man had been following his football career. He sat down on the bench next to the older man, not caring that the cold would make his clothes wet. "Thank you for saying that," Michael said with genuine appreciation. "What's your name?" "If you don't mind me asking," the man straightened his shoulders with pride before answering. "My name is Robert Harrison," he said clearly. "I served in the British Army for 22 years. Been living on these streets for about 6 months now." Robert's voice was strong and clear, without any hint of self-pity or complaint. He spoke like a man who had faced many difficult situations in his life and had learned to handle them with courage and dignity. Michael listened carefully as Robert began to share his story. Robert explained that he had lived in a small flat not far from the stadium for many years after leaving the army. He had worked various jobs and managed to save a little money over time. But then an old injury from his military service had gotten worse, requiring expensive medical treatment and surgery. "The doctors did their best to help me," Robert said calmly, "but the bills kept coming, one after another. Soon I had spent all my savings. And then I had to borrow money. When I couldn't pay the rent anymore, the landlord had no choice but to ask me to leave." Robert spoke without anger or bitterness toward anyone. He understood that everyone was just trying to do their job and take care of their own families. He didn't blame the doctors for the high medical costs, or the landlord for needing to collect rent. I don't ask people for much, Robert continued softly. Just trying to get by day, until I can find steady work again. These old hands still know how to fix things and work hard. As Michael listened to Robert's story, he felt something deep in his heart begin to change. This wasn't just any person asking for help on the street. This was a man who had dedicated over 20 years of his life to serving and protecting his country. This was someone who had earned medals for bravery and had helped other soldiers through dangerous and difficult times. Now Robert was the one who needed help. And it seemed like the world had forgotten about his years of service and sacrifice. "I'll come back to see you tomorrow, Robert," Michael promised as he stood up from the bench. Robert's face lit up with genuine surprise and gratitude. "Thank you for stopping to talk with me, son." Not many people take the time to do that anymore. That night, as Michael drove to his comfortable home, he couldn't stop thinking about Robert's gentle spirit and quiet dignity in the face of such hardship. The next evening came with the same cold winter air that had been covering Manchester for weeks. Michael finished his training session and walked quickly toward the stadium gates all day long. He had been thinking about Robert and wondering if the older man would still be sitting on the same bench as Michael approached the area where they had met the night before. He felt a mixture of hope and worry in his chest. He carried a large paper bag in one hand and a thermos of hot tea in the other. He had stopped at a local shop on his way to the stadium and bought fresh sandwiches, some fruit, and a warm drink for Robert when Michael reached the bench. He saw Robert sitting in exactly the same position as before. Robert wore the same faded military jacket, and he held the same small cardboard sign in his weathered hands. But when Robert looked up and saw Michael walking toward him, something wonderful happened to his face. "You came back," Robert said, and his tired eyes suddenly became bright with surprise and happiness. Michael sat down on the cold bench next to his new friend and opened the paper bag. "I told you I would come back," he replied with a warm smile. "And I brought some things I thought you might enjoy." The smell of fresh sandwiches filled the cold air between them. Michael poured hot tea from the thermos into 2 cups he had brought. With him, the steam from the tea rose up into the night air like small clouds, and both men wrapped their cold hands around the warm cups gratefully as they shared the simple meal together. Robert began to tell Michael more about his life story. His voice was quiet and thoughtful as he spoke about the years that had led him to this bench. "I was married to the most wonderful woman in the world," Robert said, looking down at his hands. "Her name was Emma, and we were together for 30 beautiful years. She had the kindest heart and the most beautiful laugh you ever heard." Robert paused to take a sip of his tea before continuing. "About 3 years ago, Emma got very sick with cancer. We fought that disease together for 2 long years. I took her to every doctor appointment, stayed with her through every treatment, and held her hand through every difficult night." Michael listened without saying a word, understanding that Robert needed to share these memories with someone who would truly listen. The medical bills started coming one after another. Robert continued. "First hundreds of pounds, then thousands. We used up all our savings trying to get Emma the best treatment possible. I would have spent every penny I had if it meant giving her one more day of life." Robert's voice became softer as he talked about losing his wife. "When Emma passed away, I felt like half of my heart had been torn out of my chest. The grief was so heavy that some days I could barely get out of bed, and the bills kept coming even after she was gone." Michael felt his own heart ache as he listened to Robert's story of love and loss. "I have 2 children," Robert said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "William is 35 and works as a teacher in Scotland. Margaret is 32 and lives in Wales with her husband and 2 young children." Robert pulled out an old leather wallet that looked like it had been with him. For many years, the wallet was worn and cracked, but Robert handled it with great care. He opened it slowly and showed Michael several old photographs that he kept inside. The first photograph showed a much younger Robert wearing his army uniform. He stood tall and proud, with medals pinned to his chest and a confident smile on his face. Another photo showed Robert and Emma on their wedding day, both of them glowing with happiness and love. There were also pictures of William and Margaret when they were small children, playing in a garden and laughing with their parents. In every photo, the family looked happy and close to each other. "I haven't told William and Margaret about my situation," Robert admitted, looking embarrassed. "I'm too proud to burden them with my problems. They have their own families to take care of, their own bills to pay, their own worries to handle." Robert put the photos back in his wallet carefully, as if they were made of gold instead of paper. "I worked as a mechanic in the army for all those years," Robert explained. "I could fix anything that had an engine or moving parts, trucks, generators, helicopters, you name it, even after I left the army. I worked at a local garage for 10 years. These old hands still remember how to work with tools and solve problems." As Michael listened to Robert talk about his skills and experience, he began to understand something important. Robert wasn't sitting on this bench because he was lazy or unwilling to work. He was here because life had knocked him down with a series of terrible events, and he just needed someone to give him a chance to get back on his feet. The hardest part of living like this isn't the cold weather or even being hungry, Robert said quietly. "The hardest part is feeling like you've become invisible to the world. Like your whole life and everything you've done doesn't matter to anyone anymore." Michael looked directly into Robert's eyes and spoke with complete sincerity. "Your life matters, Robert. Your service to this country matters. You matter." For the first time since Michael had met him, Robert's eyes filled with tears, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief and gratitude, because someone had finally seen him as a human being worth caring about. Over the next few days, Michael found himself thinking about Robert constantly, during training sessions, while eating meals, and even when trying to sleep at night. His mind kept returning to the dignified older man sitting alone on that cold bench. Michael knew he had to do more than just bring food and have conversations. Robert deserved better than living on the streets, especially after serving his country for so many years. Michael decided to take action, but he wanted to do it quietly without drawing attention to himself or embarrassing Robert. The next morning, he spoke privately with the stadium manager, a kind man named David who had worked there for 15 years. "I have a friend who needs a place to clean up," Michael explained carefully. "He's a veteran who's going through a difficult time. Would it be possible for him to use the shower facilities here occasionally?" David looked at Michael with understanding. He had always respected the young football player for his good character. "Of course," David replied without hesitation. "Anyone who served our country deserves our help. He can use the facilities whenever he needs to." That evening, Michael met Robert at their usual bench and gently suggested that he might want to freshen up at the stadium. At first, Robert felt uncomfortable accepting this help. "I can't take advantage of your kindness like this," Robert said, shaking his head. "You've already done too much for me." But Michael insisted, explaining that having a place to shower and clean up would help Robert feel better and might even help him when looking for work. Reluctantly, Robert agreed to accept this offer. The next step was finding Robert a proper place to sleep. Michael spent his free time calling different hotels and inns round Manchester, looking for somewhere affordable and clean. Finally, He found a small inn run by an elderly couple who were willing to provide Robert with a simple room at a reasonable price. When Michael told Robert about the room, the older man's reaction was immediate and strong. "I can't accept this," Robert protested firmly. "I won't be treated like charity. I still have my pride and dignity." Michael sat down next to Robert and looked directly into his eyes. "This isn't charity, Robert," he said with complete sincerity. "This is friendship. Real friends help each other when times are hard. If I was in trouble, wouldn't you help me if you could?" Robert thought about this for a moment and slowly nodded his head. He understood that Michael was offering help not out of pity, but out of genuine care and friendship. Michael also spent many hours on his phone and computer, researching veteran support services and job placement programs in the Manchester area. He was shocked to learn how many organizations existed to help former military personnel, but also saddened to discover that thousands of veterans across the country were struggling with problems similar to Robert's. He made lists of phone numbers and addresses, printed out application forms, and even drove Robert to several appointments with social workers and job counselors. Slowly but surely, they began to build a network of support around Robert. During their daily meetings, Michael began to notice something remarkable about Robert's character. Even though Robert had very little food and money for himself, he consistently shared whatever he received with other homeless people in the area. One evening, Michael watched as Robert gave half of his sandwich to a young man who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Another time, he saw Robert give his warm gloves to an elderly woman whose hands were blue from the cold. "Robert," Michael asked one night, "why do you give away so much when you have so little for yourself?" Robert looked round at the other homeless people who gathered near the stadium each evening. "Look at that young fellow over there," he said, pointing to a thin boy who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. "He hasn't had a proper meal in 2 days. And see that elderly lady sitting by the wall. She's been sleeping in doorways all week because she's afraid to go to the shelters." Robert's voice was gentle but firm as he continued, "There's always someone who has it worse than you do. When you help others, even in small ways, it reminds you that you're still useful, still valuable as a human being." Michael watched in amazement. Over the following weeks, as Robert naturally became a leader among the small group of homeless individuals who spent time near the stadium, Robert used the same leadership skills he had learned in the military to help organize this little community. He made sure that the most vulnerable people stayed as warm as possible on the coldest nights. When arguments or disagreements rose between people, Robert stepped in to settle disputes peacefully and fairly. He kept everyone's spirits up by telling funny stories from his army days and sharing gentle jokes that made people laugh even in their difficult circumstances. "You're still serving others," Michael observed one evening as he watched Robert help an older man find a warm place to sleep. Robert smiled, and for the first time since Michael had known him, he looked truly happy. "Old habits are hard to break, I suppose," he said. "Taking care of people has always felt like the right thing to do. It never stops feeling good to help someone else." Michael began bringing extra food and supplies every evening, not just for Robert, but for the entire small group that Robert was helping. He saw how Robert's presence brought hope and dignity to people who had lost both of those precious things. Week by week, Robert grew stronger and more confident. Having a temporary address at the inn made it possible for him to fill out job applications properly. Most importantly, his growing friendship with Michael was restoring his faith in human kindness and his belief in his own worth. 2 months had passed since Michael first met Robert on that cold winter evening outside the stadium. During this time, their friendship had grown stronger with each passing day. Robert had been staying at the small inn, showering at the stadium, and working with various support services to try to find steady employment. He looked healthier and more confident than he had in many months. But Michael had been secretly working on something special during all this time. He had been making phone calls, meeting with real estate agents, and handling paperwork without telling Robert anything about his plans. Michael believed that Robert deserved something more permanent than a temporary room at an inn on a bright sunny afternoon in early spring. Michael arrived at their usual meeting spot with an excited expression on his face. The weather had finally started to warm up after the long winter, and small flowers were beginning to bloom in the gardens round Manchester. "Robert," Michael said with barely contained excitement, "I need you to come with me somewhere today. There's something important I want to show you." Robert looked curious, but agreed without asking too many questions. He had learned to trust Michael completely over the past 2 months. They walked together to Michael's car, and Robert settled into the passenger seat. Wondering where they might be going, Michael drove carefully through several quiet neighborhoods that Robert had never seen before. These were areas filled with small, modest homes where working families lived. The streets were lined with trees, and many of the houses had tiny front gardens with colorful flowers and well-maintained lawns. After about 15 minutes of driving, Michael pulled his car to a stop in front of a particular house that immediately caught Robert's attention. It was a small, neat home painted in soft cream colors with dark green shutters on the windows. The front door was painted a cheerful blue color, and there was a tiny garden in front with a wooden bench and some rose bushes. Robert looked at the house with admiration. "This is a lovely little place," he said honestly. "Whose house is this? Are we visiting one of your friends?" Michael turned off the car engine and sat quietly for a moment, looking at Robert with a gentle smile. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small set of shiny keys attached to a simple keychain. "These keys belong to you, Robert," Michael said softly, placing them in Robert's weathered hands. Robert stared down at the keys in complete confusion. "I don't understand what you mean," he said, his voice filled with bewilderment. "What are you trying to tell me?" Michael's smile grew wider as he spoke the words that would change Robert's life forever. "I mean, this house is yours, Robert. This is your home now." Robert's mouth fell open in shock. He looked back and forth between the keys in his hands and the beautiful little house in front of them. "What do you mean it's mine?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael spoke slowly and clearly, wanting Robert to understand every word. "I mean that this house belongs to you now. You've served your country faithfully for over 20 years. You've helped so many people, even when you had almost nothing for yourself. You deserve to have a safe, comfortable place to call home." Robert's hands began to tremble as he held the keys. Tears started to form in his eyes as the reality of Michael's words began to sink in. "Michael, I can't accept something like this," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "This is too much. This is too generous. I don't deserve this." Michael placed a gentle hand on Robert's shoulder and looked directly into his friend's eyes. "It's not too much, Robert," he said with complete conviction. "This is exactly what should have happened years ago. Every person who serves their country deserves to have a home when they need one. Every human being deserves dignity and security together." They got out of the car and walked slowly toward the blue front door. Michael showed Robert how to use the key, and they stepped inside the small house for the first time. The house was perfect for Robert's needs. There was a comfortable living room with a soft sofa and chairs ranged round a stone fireplace. The kitchen was small but had everything necessary for cooking simple meals. The bedroom had a proper bed with clean sheets and warm blankets. There was even a bathroom with a shower and bathtub dot, but the most wonderful surprise was in the back garden. Michael had arranged for a small workshop to be set up there, complete with tools and a workbench where Robert could practice his mechanical skills and maybe even earn some money doing repair work for neighbors. Robert walked slowly through each room of the house, touching the walls and furniture as if he couldn't believe they were real. Finally, he sat down in the living room and began to cry. But these were not tears of sadness or despair. These were tears of overwhelming gratitude, relief, and joy. "I thought the world had forgotten about me," Robert whispered through his tears. "I thought my years of service didn't matter to anyone anymore. I thought I would spend the rest of my life invisible and alone." Michael sat down beside his friend and put his arm round Robert's shoulders. "You are not forgotten, Robert," he said firmly. "You matter to me. Your service matters to your country. Your life has value and meaning." That evening, as they sat together by the fireplace in Robert's new home, Robert made a phone call that he had been too proud and embarrassed to make for many months, with shaking hands. He dialed his son's number and waited for William to answer. "William," Robert said when he heard his son's familiar voice, "it's your father. I have some wonderful news to share with you." Use a warm, empathetic tone. News of Michael's extraordinary kindness toward Robert began to spread slowly through the Manchester community, but not because Michael had told anyone about it himself. Michael never spoke to reporters or posted anything on social media about helping Robert. He believed that true kindness should be done quietly, without expecting praise or recognition. However, people who lived in the neighborhood where Robert's house was located began to notice the remarkable friendship between the famous football player and the older veteran. They saw Michael visiting regularly, bringing groceries, and spending long hours talking with Robert on the front porch. Word spread naturally from neighbor to neighbor about this beautiful example of human compassion. The transformation in Robert's life over the following months was nothing short of miraculous. Having a stable home address and a place to shower and dress properly gave Robert the confidence he needed to start looking for work again. His military training had taught him never to give up. And now he had the foundation he needed to rebuild his life. Within 3 weeks of moving into his new home, Robert found part-time work at a local garage called Thompson's Auto Repair. The owner, an older man named George Thompson, was initially hesitant to hire someone who had been homeless. But when Robert demonstrated his mechanical skills by quickly diagnosing and fixing a complicated engine problem, George knew he had found a valuable employee. Robert's decades of experience working with military vehicles had given him knowledge and skills that impressed everyone at the garage. He could fix problems that stumped younger mechanics, and he worked with the careful precision that came from years of maintaining equipment that soldiers' lives depended on. But Robert's greatest source of happiness came not from his job, but from his opportunity to help other people who were facing the same struggles he had experienced. He began volunteering at the Manchester Veteran Support Center 3 evenings each week. Using his military background and recent personal experience to help other homeless veterans navigate the complicated system of social services and support programs, Robert had a special gift for connecting with veterans who had lost hope. When he walked into the support center wearing clean clothes and carrying himself with dignity, other homeless veterans could see that positive change was possible. His presence alone was proof that even the most difficult situations could improve. "I know exactly what it feels like to be forgotten by the world," Robert would tell the veterans who came to the center seeking help. "I know what it's like to feel invisible. Like your service and sacrifice don't matter to anyone anymore. But I want you to understand something important. You are not alone in this struggle. We take care of each other." just like we did when we served our country. Robert's gentle manner and genuine understanding made him incredibly effective at helping other veterans. He knew which social workers were most helpful, which programs had the shortest waiting lists, and which organizations provided the best support services. More importantly, he knew how to help veterans maintain their dignity while asking for help. Meanwhile, Michael was quietly working on something even bigger, without seeking any publicity or recognition. He used some of his football earnings to establish a small foundation dedicated to helping homeless veterans find housing and employment. He insisted that the foundation operate completely privately, with no media attention or public ceremonies. Michael's foundation worked closely with existing veteran support organizations to identify veterans who needed housing assistance. The foundation would help with security deposits, first month's rent, and basic furniture for veterans who found stable employment. The real victory for Michael was not any recognition he might receive, but seeing lives transformed and people regaining their independence. 6 months after Robert had moved into his new home, he received the phone call he had been hoping for since the day Michael first gave him the keys. His son William called to say that he and Robert's daughter Margaret wanted to come to Manchester to visit their father in his new home. The reunion was emotional and healing for the entire family. William and Margaret could hardly believe the positive changes they saw in their father. Robert looked healthy, confident, and happy in a way they hadn't seen since before their mother Emma had become ill. "Dad, we're so sorry we lost touch with you during your difficult time," Margaret said through tears of joy and regret. "We should have been there to help you." Robert hugged his daughter tightly. "You have your own families to take care of," he said gently. "I didn't want to burden you with my problems, but I'm grateful that we can be together again now." Margaret looked round her father's comfortable little home and asked, "How did all this happen? How did you find your way back to hope?" Robert smiled and looked toward the window where he could see Michael working in the garden. "A young man reminded me that every life has value," he replied with deep gratitude in his voice. "He showed me that kindness still exists in the world." The story reaches its perfect ending on a beautiful autumn day, when the leaves are changing colors and falling gently in Robert's back garden. Robert is in his workshop, teaching carpentry and mechanical skills to 3 other veterans who had recently been homeless but were now getting their lives back on track. Michael stops by after his football training, as he does every week, to have tea and conversation with his dear friend. They sit together in the garden, watching Robert's students work with their hands and rebuild their lives with their hearts. "You know what I learned from all this?" Michael tells Robert as they watch the sunset. "What's that?" Robert asks with curiosity. "True success isn't measured by trophies or fame or money," Michael says thoughtfully. "It's measured by how we treat each other, especially those who need help the most." Robert nods with deep understanding, knowing that their friendship has created ripples of kindness that continue to spread throughout the community, proving that when we remember the humanity in each other, we can change the world one person at a time. The end.